Alright, so if you're even a little bit familiar with the history of Apple, you probably know that there was a time in the 1990s when the company wasn't doing so well. Their product line had become rather confusing. They had been through two short-lived CEOs, and in 1996 reported a loss of $700 million. It was a time when the future of Apple was uncertain. But with the purchase of Next Software in December 1996, Apple acquired NextStep, the operating system that would become the foundation for the next generation of the Mac OS. And Steve Jobs, one of Apple's co-founders, returned, initially holding an advisory role. In August of 1997, he took the stage at that year's Macworld conference to announce a new partnership. Of course, we're talking about the 1997 Macworld deal between Apple and Microsoft, two companies that have had a bit of a complicated relationship, starting out as business partners and later becoming competitors. And while this deal is a historic moment in the history of these two companies, the purpose behind it has been mistaken by many. A part of this deal was Microsoft making a $150 million investment in Apple, which many have claimed single-handedly saved the company from bankruptcy. But this actually isn't the case at all. And today we're going to be talking about the real reason behind this investment and how it did not save Apple. Before we get into that though, I want to talk a little about myself, because for whatever reason it seems when somebody makes an argument that can be construed as defending Apple, the accusations of that person being an Apple fanboy, Apple sheep, iSheep, etc. are inevitable. So I want to tell you that I'm not an Apple fanboy. In fact, I'm not even a Mac user. I've been using Windows for my entire life and prefer it to Mac OS. Now, I do like Apple products, I use an iPhone, and I even collect older Apple computers, but I have no reason to try and change historical events to make a company look better. But this video is not an Apple defense video. All I want to do is correct the record. I want to talk about a topic that has had so much misinformation surrounding it for years. And if you're somebody who believes that Apple wouldn't exist today if Microsoft hadn't stepped in back in 1997, I want to give you the reasons that completely dispute this claim. The common theory goes like this. In 1997, Apple was going bankrupt. Also around that time, Microsoft was being investigated by the federal government over accusations that the company was abusing its power and engaging in monopolistic business practices. To prove that they weren't a monopoly, Microsoft decided to invest in Apple by giving them $150 million. This saved Apple, and by doing so it proved that Microsoft wasn't a monopoly because they had a viable competitor. But there are some major problems with this theory, and today I'm going to highlight three aspects of it that are just plain wrong. We'll be discussing the events that led up to Microsoft making this investment, how simply having Apple around would not help Microsoft in their antitrust case, and how the investment did not save Apple from bankruptcy. So what actually made Microsoft give Apple $150 million? Well, it surely wasn't out of the kindness of their heart. This is why the, "oh, but they did it to prove they weren't a monopoly" theory seems to hold water at first, until you realize that this investment wasn't made on a whim voluntarily. In fact, it was the result of a lawsuit that seems to have been forgotten about by many. And to understand it, we gotta head back to the early 90s and talk about QuickTime, a framework that was a groundbreaking development in the world of multimedia. According to computerhistory.org, prior to QuickTime, the most effective means of mixing video into an interactive computer presentation on a personal computer was with software controlling a Laserdisc player connected to the computer via an RS-232 serial cable playing video on a television. Apple also provided a set of QuickTime APIs, which allowed developers to incorporate QuickTime technology into their own applications. Needless to say, QuickTime was a very important development, and Apple wanted to port it over to Windows, so they hired the San Francisco Canyon Company to develop a port, which was released in 1992. But around the same time, Microsoft was also working on their own multimedia framework, known as Video for Windows. It wasn't as advanced as QuickTime was and had some limitations, but all of that changed when Intel, wanting to improve the performance of video for Windows, contracted the same company that Apple hired to port QuickTime to Windows. This led to Microsoft and Intel working together and creating the Display Control Interface, or DCI, a technology that was implemented into Video for Windows version 1.1D. And the inclusion of this technology vastly improved the performance of Video for Windows. But it wasn't all as it seemed, because in working with the San Francisco Canyon Company, Microsoft and Intel had pirated several hundred lines of code that were used in the Windows version of QuickTime, and illegally used them in their competing product. Upon discovering this, Apple filed a lawsuit, initially against the San Francisco Canyon Company, but later added Intel and Microsoft to it. A court issued a temporary restraining order forcing Microsoft to stop distributing version 1.1D of Video for Windows, which the company did by creating a new version, 1.1E, which removed the infringing code. And this lawsuit is how Microsoft and Apple began talking. Apple was initially very generous, saying in their 1995 open letter to the computing community that they attempted to keep Microsoft and Intel out of the lawsuit by talking to them privately to remove the stolen code from Video for Windows. But both companies refused these requests multiple times, so Apple said, "We were left with two options. Let the two most powerful companies in the industry get away with software piracy, or go to court. We chose to defend our rights and to attempt to bring this matter to a close as quickly as possible. It's very disappointing that we ended up in this situation, especially since Intel and Microsoft have, in other situations, taken a strong stand against software piracy." Apple even went as far as to establish an amnesty program that allowed third-party developers who unknowingly used the version of Video for Windows containing the pirated code to continue using it for free for the entire life of their current products. But Apple eventually added Microsoft to the lawsuit against Canyon, and in return, Microsoft began making threats to Apple. Internal emails between Bill Gates and other Microsoft employees came to light in the class action lawsuit Combs v. Microsoft. In one of these emails, discussions of canceling Microsoft Office for Mac were had. Bill Gates received an email on June 27, 1997, which said, in part, "The threat to cancel Mac Office 97 is certainly the strongest bargaining point we have, as doing so will do a great deal of harm to Apple immediately. I also believe that Apple is taking this threat pretty seriously." Now, eventually, the two companies settled the lawsuit out of court, and at the 1997 Macworld Expo, a deal was announced. And while the investment of $150 million was perceived by many as Microsoft being generous and helping Apple, in actuality, it was only a portion of the money that Microsoft had to pay Apple. According to Apple's CFO at the time, Fred Anderson, the QuickTime patent dispute was resolved with cross-licensing and significant payment to Apple. This was the patent dispute Steve Jobs was referring to when he said,
"The discussions actually began because there were some patent disputes. And rather than, rather than repeating history, I'm extremely proud of both companies that they have resolved these differences in a very, very professional way."
Apple also got an additional $100 to $150 million from Microsoft to settle these disputes, and it's possible that they could have gotten even more. So Microsoft did not make this investment voluntarily. But even if they did, it would not make them look any better during the antitrust case, as is often claimed. That's because the antitrust case didn't have anything to do with Microsoft's relationship with Apple. It was about the bundling of Internet Explorer with Windows to essentially guarantee its growth over time. Microsoft began bundling their web browser with later versions of Windows 95. and by the time Windows 98 was released, the web browser was heavily integrated into the operating system, meaning that it could not be uninstalled very easily, if at all. This is known as product tying, bundling one product, Internet Explorer, with another unrelated product, in this case the Windows operating system. This is what the US government was claiming, that Windows and Internet Explorer were two separate products in two different markets, and the act of bundling them together hurt competition. For example, Netscape Navigator, which was the most popular web browser before Internet Explorer came on the scene, cost money to get, but Internet Explorer was free and already pre-installed on your computer. So it was thought that new computer buyers would just opt to use the free web browser that they already had, instead of going out and paying for one. And that's exactly what happened. Internet Explorer's market share grew and Netscape Navigator's declined, ultimately forcing the company to go in a completely different direction, as I talk about in my Netscape retrospective video, which you can check out here. Microsoft, on the other hand, claimed that Internet Explorer was just another component of the Windows operating system and not a separate product. The point is, this wasn't about Apple. Whether Apple stayed in business or not wouldn't affect the outcome of this ruling. Just because there is another company selling the same types of products that you do doesn't single-handedly prove that you're not a monopoly. Sure, it's a huge indicator that you are a monopoly if you are the sole provider of a good or service, but there are other factors as well. And one of them is the types of business practices that you engage in. I mean, Netscape was a competitor to Internet Explorer. So how could the government investigate Microsoft for being a monopoly? They had competition. But that didn't prove anything. Microsoft was engaging in anti-competitive business practices and using their influence to gain an unfair advantage. That was the issue. In 1996, Netscape sent a letter to the Department of Justice accusing Microsoft of violating a 1994 consent decree, in which Microsoft promised not to use their influence as the largest operating system developer in the country to prevent consumer choice with respect to applications. Specifically, Netscape accused Microsoft of charging more money for Windows licenses when selling to PC OEMs who wanted to include both Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator with their systems, paying certain telecommunications customers to switch to Internet Explorer from Netscape Navigator, and offering to buy out contracts that Netscape had with certain internet service providers. The question was not, did Microsoft have competition? Because by the very definition of what competition is, they did. Netscape was a competitor to Internet Explorer. macOS was a competitor to Windows. The question was, did Microsoft engage in business practices like these, ones that are anti-competitive, in an attempt to thwart their competition? And giving $150 million to Apple, who again had nothing to do with this case, to supposedly save them from bankruptcy, even if it was out of their own free will, would not make a difference for Microsoft. It would not change the anti-competitive business practices the company was accused of engaging in, and it certainly would not do anything to change their dominance in the PC operating system and web browser markets. And look, if that was the solution for proving that Microsoft wasn't a monopoly, just giving money to other companies to prop them up, why didn't they give millions of dollars to Netscape? Because giving money to a smaller company to keep them in business does not prove that you're not a monopoly. If anything, it does the opposite. It proves that you are a monopoly, because your business practices are affecting the profits of other companies to the point where you have to give them money to create the illusion that you have viable competitors. It just doesn't hold up. Some of the largest monopolies in history, like Standard Oil and AT&T, one of these was much larger than the other, by the way, were not resolved by the companies just giving money away to other companies, because they would still be able to maintain their monopolistic power. They were resolved by the government forcing the companies to split up into as many as 34 individual entities in the case of Standard Oil. And this is what the government was seeking to do with Microsoft. Simply giving money away while still engaging in the same business practices is not going to change anything. And even if you think that Apple simply existing as a company proves that Microsoft wasn't a monopoly, then why, in the year 2000, after Apple was back on their feet, after they had become profitable again, why did the Department of Justice, in their ruling, decide that Microsoft was a monopoly? Microsoft almost had to break up into two different companies because of this ruling, but it was later overturned when an appeal was filed. And to further make this point, let's look at the Macworld deal a little closer. In addition to the cash that Microsoft gave Apple, they also committed to developing Microsoft Office for Mac for the next 5 years, and Apple agreed to make Internet Explorer the Mac's default browser, which didn't go over very well with the crowd, to say the least.
Apple has decided to make Internet Explorer its default browser on the Macintosh.
And considering that, again, the largest aspect of the antitrust case against Microsoft was their bundling of Internet Explorer with Windows to increase its market share, don't you think that by having the browser pre-installed on even more computers would hurt them in the antitrust case, because it would eat away at Netscape's market share even more? Well, the government certainly did, because they cited this very arrangement in the antitrust case, and alleged that Microsoft forced Apple to agree to it, and if they didn't, Microsoft would stop developing Office for Mac. The government further claimed that the 1997 deal was actually another way Microsoft attempted to get rid of Netscape. Even though Apple could ship other browsers with Macintosh computers, as Steve Jobs had stated, the government found that the deal actually prevented Apple from promoting any of those browsers in any way. They could only use Internet Explorer as the default and promote it. All of this diminished Netscape's market share even further, and it shows that Microsoft was not trying to use this agreement with Apple to strengthen their defense in the antitrust case, because it actually strengthened the prosecution. And finally, I want to examine the claim that this $150 million saved Apple from bankruptcy. Now look, there's no doubt that Apple wasn't doing so well financially at the time. As I said at the beginning of the video, they reported a loss of $700 million in 1996. But this doesn't mean that Apple didn't have any money in the bank or wasn't worth anything as a company. So how much money did Apple have? Well, what better way to find out than looking at Apple's own Form 10-K, a form that must be filed each year by every publicly traded company in the United States with the SEC. In September of 1996, Apple had $1.5 billion in cash and cash equivalents. When you add other assets like property and equipment, the company's total value was over $5 billion. Now you can see from this chart that Apple lost about $1 billion between 1996 and 1997. So saying that Apple wouldn't be here today without Microsoft's $150 million investment also is not true. And to quote from a Wired article written at the time, "For Apple, the cash is symbolic. While the company has been bleeding money, it has about $1.2 billion in cash, according to its last quarterly earnings report, and it doesn't need Microsoft's money to fend off immediate starvation." Apple CFO Fred Anderson said that the money would be invested in Apple's core markets, education and multimedia creation. But let's say all of that wasn't true and Apple was actually only worth $150 million. Well, then they would have gone bankrupt only 2 months later when they reported a quarterly loss of $161 million. Yeah, they lost more money than Microsoft invested in them. But they're still here. Now I know that some of you will ask, well, what about that quote from Steve Jobs when he said that Apple was 90 days from going bankrupt when he returned? And you're right, he absolutely said that. Look, there is no doubt that Apple was on the verge of bankruptcy, but they needed more than just cash to save the company. The fact is, Apple's business, product, and marketing strategies weren't working. And this is what had to change, which Steve Jobs helped to do when he returned. Money would absolutely help, but it would just prolong the inevitable if Apple had changed nothing about their product and business strategies. Now, if Apple needed the money, if they had no value whatsoever and were going to go bankrupt without it, then I would absolutely agree that Microsoft saved Apple from bankruptcy. But even in this scenario, saying that Apple wouldn't be here today without Microsoft is a complete exaggeration. Bankruptcy is often associated with going out of business, which is partly true. If a company files for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, this, in essence, shuts down the company. A bankruptcy trustee is appointed to oversee the liquidation of the company, which involves selling assets to pay back as many creditors as possible. But Chapter 7 is often used as a last resort, when there is no possibility of the company ever recovering. If Apple had gone bankrupt, they would have likely filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. This essentially puts the company in a state of limbo. The business remains in operation, but most creditors are temporarily prevented from collecting money from the company. This allows its board of directors to focus on restructuring and becoming profitable again. However, all major business decisions would have to be approved by the bankruptcy court. And given that Apple's new product strategy worked and allowed them to become profitable again, I don't see why it wouldn't in this case. So, did the money from Microsoft help Apple? Absolutely, I don't think anyone disputes that. But did it single-handedly save the company from bankruptcy? No, not at all. But if you were to look up, did Microsoft save Apple, you'd probably believe the contrary. When researching for this video, I came across countless news articles about the event, and most of them summed it up to Apple was going to go bankrupt, but Microsoft came in and saved them, often using the same Microsoft needed to prove they weren't a monopoly argument to explain why the money was invested. I even got some comments like this one on my How Internet Explorer Became Apple's Default Browser video, calling the video misleading because I didn't talk about how Microsoft supposedly saved Apple. This was one of the top comments on that video for a while, and the fact that it got there with over 200 upvotes shows that this depiction of events is still widely accepted as fact by many people. However, if you were to look at news articles from around the time the Macworld event actually happened, you'll get a much different picture. We already discussed the Wired article, which clearly explains how Apple did not need Microsoft's money to avoid bankruptcy. But here's a quote from a CNET article from around this time. Given the size of Microsoft, a $150 million commitment amounts to little more than good public relations. Remember, they spent $450 million on Web TV. The investment still doesn't give Apple a coherent strategy for turning things around. In essence, what we just discussed. Even if Apple needed the money, they would have to do much more than just take it to stay in business. So, to recap, Microsoft didn't save Apple. They didn't invest $150 million in the company out of their own free will. They paid a settlement to Apple as a result of pirating software from them. There is no doubt that Apple was losing money, but they were worth billions of dollars and could afford to stay afloat at least for a little while. What really saved Apple was new leadership, a new product strategy, and new products like the iMac and iBook, products that sold very well and helped Apple get back on track at becoming a profitable company again. And even if Microsoft made this investment voluntarily, even if everything else in this video I said wasn't true and they actually saved Apple from bankruptcy, it would not prove in the slightest that they weren't a monopoly or somehow forgive any of their past monopolistic actions. So hopefully this video cleared some things up and finally put this rumor to rest after so many years. If you enjoyed this episode and found it interesting, be sure to give it a like and get subscribed. And as always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.